We're going to start with a presentation titled by our speaker, Dysfunction by Design, How PA State House Rules Game the System, Silence Debate, and Damage Democracy. That will be presented by Tony Crocomo. Tony has been an FDPA volunteer since September 2016. He's one of our most long-term volunteers. He helped initiate our Speakers Bureau. In fact, I think that was Tony's idea to start a Speakers Bureau. And he continues as a speaker as well as a mentor and trainer in our advocacy advisor team. He's also a repeat winner of the Lancaster Story Slam. If you have questions during his presentation or any part, as I said, look for the question function, the little Q&A at the bottom of your screen. After his presentation, we will hear from several legislators who were elected in 2018 about their experience, what they have learned about procedural rules, and changes that they might like to see. We'll have some Q&A with them, and then we will hear from some legislators who've been with us longer, who have been in the State House longer, and they will also take some Q&A. At the very end, I'll suggest a few ways that we can continue this conversation, but you will all also receive a follow-up email if you registered with us for this event, which I'm assuming you all did. You'll get a follow-up email with some ideas to keep the conversation going. Before Tony starts, I just want to say a few things about how this came about. We have a Reform the Rules team that's been working on this since a town hall we had on December 1st in 2018 on this topic. That team is led by Rachel Goff, who has dedicated a great deal of time over the last 2 years to trying to understand why some really good bills don't ever get a vote in committee and some really awful bills go flying through really fast. She has a team that have been digging into legislative records, and Rachel put together the initial presentation, and then our Speakers Bureau coordinator, Ruth Yeiser, and Tony Crocomo did the final work to pull this together. So thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Kathy and Jody and others who are members of that team that does the Reform the Rules work. And thank you, Ruth. Ruth leads our Speakers Bureau, and they together have done presentations to over 930 venues and over 33,000 people. So obviously people are interested in gerrymandering and also very interested in this issue of reforming the rules. I just want to say that Fair Districts PA is a nonpartisan coalition. We have over 40 endorsing organizations. We're a fiscal project of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania and part of the National League of Women Voters People-Powered Fair Maps Initiative. We are a completely volunteer-led organization, including myself. We have groups in all parts of the state and supporters in every county in Pennsylvania. Our goal is to ensure a fair redistricting process in Pennsylvania in 2021 and beyond, and to make sure our legislature listens and works for all of us, no matter our location or our party affiliation, which is why we are talking about rules today. So thank you for joining us in that effort. Thank you, Tony, for presenting today. And we are going to turn to Tony and his presentation. Remember, if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them in the Q&A at the bottom. Thank you, Tony.
So, dysfunction by design, how the Pennsylvania State House game the system, silence debate, and damage democracy. That may sound a bit severe, but that's only because we're at the beginning of this. By the end, I'm sure you'll agree with me. So, does the legislature represent us? Some people think they do, some people think they don't. I'm going to present a case that they don't really represent us at all. And the example I'm going to use is in the last 4 years, Fair Districting has had a number of legislative efforts that have gone nowhere, despite significant support from many quarters, including sorry. All right, I'm gonna have to do it this way, excuse me. Including more co-sponsors than any other legislation in the sessions. Resolutions by 23 counties, 350 municipalities, and this includes about 70% of the population of Pennsylvania. Their regional governments approved redistricting reform, but the bills went nowhere. We had over 100,000 petition signatures, but the bills went nowhere. We had 500 plus supportive letters to the editors and papers across the state, plus scores of editorials in papers across the state supporting redistricting reform, and still the bills went nowhere. And over 66% of Pennsylvania citizens support redistricting reform according to an F&M poll. And still, the bills went nowhere. Matter of fact, they didn't just go nowhere. They were never allowed a floor vote in the House or Senate, despite all those co-sponsors, all those resolutions, all those petition signatures, all those letters to the editors and editorials, and the overwhelming support of the Pennsylvania citizens. Those bills went nowhere, never allowed a vote. So why does that happen? Why no debate? Why no vote? Sorry for the problems here. Well, the problems, speaking of problems, the problems are the rules. The rules govern the process. And the rules are written by the majority party. They make the rules. That makes sense. But the rules give the party leaders complete control over the legislative agenda, the legislative process. One committee chair, in fact, one committee chair outweighs all the other members in the House. And in the Senate, a committee chair outweighs all the other members in the Senate. And they also outweigh the will of the people, because that one committee chair sets the agenda for the committee. He or she decides what bills will be discussed, what bills will be voted on, what bills will get released out of committee. And if the committee chair doesn't want a bill to go anywhere, it doesn't. And also the majority leader, even if the bill gets out of committee, the majority leader or the speaker can derail the legislative process on those bills. They can rule with a whim of iron. They can stop legislation because they don't like the legislator who proposed it. They can do it for ideological reasons. They can do it because they have contributors who don't want that bill to go through, and they serve their purpose rather than the public's. And this creates an unchecked power and a dangerous imbalance. And again, these three positions, committee chair, majority leader, or speaker, control the process, control the agenda, and are the reason we want the rules to be reformed. Now, these same three positions, members of those positions will often talk about transparency and accountability. Well, it's time to stop talking about transparency and accountability and to do something about it. Now, the first thing the legislature does is they vote on the rules for the session. And basically, our legislators surrender their ability to represent us on the first day of the session. First day of the session, House Resolution 1, the rules are introduced. And there's no time for review. Last session, it was over 60 pages. They were introduced on the first day of the session, voted on that same day. Nobody reviewed that. There's no public input. There's no even way to have public input on it. And in 2019, before they passed H.R. 1, they passed H.R. 2. And what was H.R. 2? H.R. 2 prohibited any amendments to H.R. 1. So before we pass the resolution, the rules, let's make sure there's no way to fix them. And by voting for H.R. 1, lawmakers willingly silence their own voices and their ability to represent us. They cede all control to the party leaders. They give it away. They're putting party before people. They're putting party before their own ability to represent us. Is that transparent? Is that accountable? You know, the game is fixed. And again, the problem is the rules. Speakers appoint chairs and demote chairs. The chair decides if a bill gets a hearing or a vote. The chair isn't going to upset the speaker, majority leader, or anybody else. And so he or she is not going to promote bills that aren't popular with the speaker, the majority leader. Yeah, as W.C. Fields said in My Little Chickadee, when asked, is this a game of chance? Not the way I play it, no. Not only is it not a game of chance, it's not transparent or accountable. Now, who holds the cards in this fixed game? One representative, and this is just some simple math, there are 203 representatives in a House, so one is about 0.5% of PA voters. Committee Chair Garth Everett, he didn't run again this time, but ran in 2018. He won his election with 18,000 votes. And that was 80% of the vote in his district. Speaker Brian Cutler was elected with 14,000 votes, and that was 72% of the vote in his district. And Majority Leader Kerry Benninghoff was elected with 17,000 votes, 60% in his district. Now, these three gentlemen ran the show. Nothing went to a vote without their say-so, without their permission. And they often, point the finger at each other. Well, if it gets out of committee, I think we should have a vote on it. And that's just a way for them to duck responsibility. Legislation they support gets passed. Legislation they're not interested in, despite what the public may want, don't get any action. Now, the public is often asking, why don't they reach across the aisle? Why can't they work together? Why can't they cooperate? Why can't they reach across the aisle and work together? We hear that a lot. We say it ourselves. This might give you an indication. This illustration here is from the Pennsylvania House Commonwealth Flyer, a publication of the House called Making Law MPA. And the flyer basically states that majority minority party members meet in separate caucus rooms to review bills, decide to support what bills they're going to support, what bills they're not going to support. And this is based on what the party leaders want, not what the public wants. So there's no collaboration or cooperation between the parties. They don't reach across the aisle because there is no aisle. They're in separate rooms. There's no way for the two parties to get together and work together. It's discouraged under the rules in Pennsylvania, and that's one of the big problems we have. 85% of successful bills in Pennsylvania are introduced by the majority party. Majority party picks committee chairs. Committee chairs advance partisan party agenda. And this would happen if the Democrats were in control too under the same rules. You're not going to support legislation unless it goes along with your party's ideology. That's why there's no cooperation. That's why you can't get the best ideas from the Democrats and the best ideas from the Republicans and work together. Everybody thinks that they have a lock on the best ideas, and the public knows it's true. And we're increasingly becoming a country of moderates governed by the extremes. Now, you think a legislature would legislate. Not so much in ours. 2013, 2014, there were over 5,000 bills proposed. 381 passed, less than 7%. 2015, 2016, nearly 4,000 bills were introduced, 214 passed, less than 6%. Over 93% of the bills in Pennsylvania, in the Pennsylvania legislature, go nowhere. Our full-time legislature is the largest full-time legislature in the country. It's one of the most expensive legislatures in the country, and it is the least productive legislature in the country. And this is a trifecta of disaster. We're paying more and we're getting less. They aren't representing us. It's not just redistricting reform. 75% of proposed bills never get a vote in committee. Then those 30% of the 2017, 2018 House bills that got out of committee never got a floor vote. 50% of the bills that pass one chamber don't get a vote in the other chamber. And it's all because of the rules. We have to reform the rules. Unless this changes, nothing changes. The rules control the process. The leaders draw districts, distorted districts protect incumbents, then the majority caucus leaders control the rules, and the unfair rules block reform, and we are in this cycle of dysfunction, and around we go. And it doesn't have to be this way. It isn't this way in every legislature across the country. The map here shows, and the darker areas, the darker purple areas, are those states that have good processes, better processes for collaboration and working together in policymaking. You'll notice Colorado has 100% ranking. Pennsylvania has 0. According to the Fair Vote and Bipartisan Policy Centers, Pennsylvania doesn't have any collaborative processes. There's no way for the Republicans and the Democrats to work together, to compromise, to pass legislation that the public wants. 4 years, Fair District PA's popular legislation for redistricting reform went nowhere. 4 years in the Pennsylvania legislature. Colorado passed redistricting reform in 28 days. The bills were introduced in April 2018. They were passed unanimously in May. And then voter referendum in November, 71% of the vote. Very popular legislation. The people wanted it, and this legislature delivered. Pennsylvania, we have similar numbers. We're almost 71% of the public supports redistricting in Pennsylvania. But our legislature ignores it. They don't care what the people think. Committees where bills go to die. The chairs, again, control the committees. Most bills are ignored. Chairs send one bill to another committee to die. Now imagine a bill getting some movement in a committee. The chair could just reassign it. And this gives the impression of something happening. Oh, we thought it was better controlled in that committee over there, so we sent it over there. I can't help it if they didn't do anything. Not my fault. Not transparent, not accountable. And there are other ways to hammer democracy too. Majority leader can deny a vote to any bill reported out of committee. So even if a bill gets out of committee, it still gets killed. Bills passed in one chamber can be denied and are denied a vote by majority leader in the other chamber. It's not transparent or accountable. And issues ignored. I mean, this is a serious issue. Pennsylvania has a serious issue with lead poisoning, forgive me. And there are 18 Pennsylvania cities that have a higher level of lead exposure than Flint, Michigan. 18 cities. And this map shows, and those the dark red are those counties that have serious lead not serious, higher levels of lead, blood levels in childhood, in children's blood than the rest of the state. And the legislature does nothing about it. Now, in 2015, 2016, there were proposals for lead bills, including lead testing for institutions serving younger children, lead abatement assistance, task force to study the lead problem in Pennsylvania, mandated lead testing as part of real estate sales and Pennsylvania sales. Those bills were introduced in 2015, 2016. None of them got a vote. None of them got a vote. Those same bills are introduced in 2019, 2020. I'm sorry, 2017, 2018. None got a committee vote. Couldn't get out of committee. 2019, 2020, bills were introduced again, same bills are introduced again. None got a vote out of committee. And what I want to know is, who is in favor? Who is in favor of lead poisoning? That we can't get bills out of committee. Now, it's not that they're completely useless. The legislature in 2019, the House did pass a resolution. They passed a resolution, meaningless, but they passed a resolution to recognize Lead Awareness Week. That resolution passed a month after the proposed week had passed. The legislature can't get the lead out. And again, who watching this webinar is in favor of lead poisoning? Doesn't have to be this way. It's the rules. If we can change the rules, we can change this process. Some rules changes that might make a difference, and these are just suggestions. Guarantee a vote in committee for bills with strong bipartisan support. Why not? They have strong bipartisan support. You can define that by X number of committee members from each party support it. Give it a vote. We're not saying automatically pass stuff. We're saying give him a vote. Let's find out where our legislators stand. They are ducking responsibility by never voting on these issues that are important to us. Guarantee a vote in the chamber floor for strong bipartisan bills that get voted out of committee. Again, once it gets voted out of committee, Speaker can make sure it never gets voted on. Bills of strong bipartisan support that pass one chamber should get a vote in the other chamber. Why not? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with our representatives standing up and voting on these issues that are important to us? Legislative leaders aren't the least bit motivated to decrease their power. The only way it will change is if voters demand it. After all, this is a democracy. That's stirring words. That's wonderful. 1996, Keystone Capers opinion. The voters have to demand this change. It's been too long. It's been too long. No matter what issue is important to you, whether it's property tax reform, health care, internet access in rural areas, whatever issue is important to you, if we don't have a responsive legislature, it doesn't matter. Nothing changes unless this changes. Good bills deserve a vote. Reform the rules. And what I hope you do with this information, before we get into some questions, is I hope you talk to your legislators, your local legislators. And one of the things I would love to have you ask them, and let Fair Districts know what their response is. Ask them why, on the first day of the session, they would willingly vote to strip themselves of any power they have to represent us by voting for the rules as they're currently structured. Why would they do that? Ask them why they ran if they don't want to represent us. So Carol, I guess we'll start taking questions, and I'm going to stop. Well, I probably shouldn't stop the sharing yet in case there's somebody wants to go back to something.
Well, I think we'll stop that. We will stop and we'll take a couple of questions, but then we're going to move on to the legislators because they can answer some of the questions that have been asked. So I will say first that we will be sharing in an email to everybody who registered the link to a document that we've been studying a lot for the last 2 years from Fair Vote and the Bipartisan Policy Center that talks about collaborative policymaking and best practices. And they interviewed legislators from around the country. They looked at rules in states around the country, and that's where that score of 0 came from, and the score for Colorado was 100. We'll share the link to that because if you start looking at that, you can see that there are specific ways to build collaboration to ensure that good bills get a vote, which is our goal here, to say that good bills deserve a vote, and we would like to see rules in place that allow that to happen. So we will be sharing that link, that document. There was also a question, is it possible to get these slides? We will make this PowerPoint available, but we also have a speakers bureau. If you go to our website, fairdistrictspa.com, look at the Take Action section. There's a link on that page to request a speaker. And Tony, and we have about 20 speakers who have been studying this, thinking about this, and are prepared to talk about it, because there are groups across the state who have been advocating for specific things for years and never seen movement. We've been tracking some of those bills, like the lead exposure bill, school funding bills, broadband access bills. There's a lot of different bills we've been tracking and thinking about the groups that have put their hearts into this kind of advocacy for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and never seen movement. We want people to understand why that is. So we will be making these slides available to groups that want them, but also feel free to request a speaker and we'll provide that. Also, we are recording this. We will have it available on YouTube, and we'll include the link with that email that goes out. That email will go out tomorrow afternoon with a link to the recording and a link to some of these other things and ideas for continuing the conversation. I have to say, we had 1,136 people register. It looks like I had upgraded our webinar license to accommodate that, but I've seen a few emails saying that there are people being told that we've maxed out, that there's no more room. We have 532 people right now, so our webinar license before was for 500. It looks like we're being cut off. So you are the lucky folks, those of you who are here, but we will certainly share the link and make sure that anybody who wanted to see it has access to it. What I want to do now is introduce introduce our first group of legislators one by one. I'll introduce one at a time, and then as a panel, they will answer some questions. So we're going to start with Senator Lindsey Williams, and she was elected in 2018. She was a member of the Senate State Government Committee, was very supportive in her interest in our redistricting bills in that committee. She is from Senate District 38 in Allegheny County. And there has been question about, last time around, we talked about House rules. We did not focus on the Senate. We're focusing a lot on the House, but this is an issue in the Senate. She's going to talk a little bit about that. And we are looking for ways to be supportive to change in the Senate as well as the House. So thank you, Senator Williams, for joining us today.
Oh, did you want me to go and then you're going to introduce the other people? I apologize. Well, thank you, Carol, and thank you for the rest of the Fair Districts team for putting this together and inviting me. And Tony, thank you for your great presentation. You know, I was an activist before I ran for state Senate, so I was fairly aware of the rules and how bills kind of languish. But, you know, being there is a whole different thing, and seeing how the rules are played to keep things from coming up and keeping them from public view, it's something that has become really important to me, because it hampers my ability to represent my constituents. And when people call and they get very frustrated about, they hear about this bill, when is it going to come up? And there is no ability for me in the minority to tell them, to give them that answer. And it's pretty frustrating to me, and it's frustrating to my constituents. So myself, Senator Katie Muth, Senator Costa, we've been talking about ways to reform the rules. And yes, it's things like every bill gets a vote and every bill gets a committee hearing, things like that. So it gets out in public and people can see it. But it's also tend to be a little more in the weeds that you might not think about rules for notice. For instance, having X amount of hours of notice before a committee hearing is called, and X amount of hours before notice of an amendment. Because a lot of times, in my experience, what has happened is committee meetings get called at the very last minute, and a big important bill gets dropped, sometimes within an hour or less of me going into a committee meeting. And these are 90-page bills that you're expected to try to read and understand and get input in, and it's literally not possible. I mean, Act 77, which was what reformed our voting rules and did our vote by mail, there were some good things in there, but that bill was an amendment. It was a 90-some page amendment that didn't have the opportunity for the public to see and to go through. And that's part of the reason why you're seeing a lot of this litigation, is because there was a lot of sloppy drafting that wasn't able to get worked out actual full process. I've had other smaller amendments dropped where I thought I understood it and it was explained to me one way and I voted and it turns out that wasn't it. So I have a new rule that unless I have time to read something, my vote is no. So that's something that's important to me. And also things like calling the question on the floor. So that is something that the majority can do, and it ends debate on a bill where you can't have debate and you can't introduce any more amendments. So that is what happened when we were fighting the end of general assistance, and Senator Katie Muth made the news about, and while reading the letter from the homeless man into the record, that all happened because they ended debate. And that's something that the public should have access to see. And I think the last priority for me is making our website more accessible, making it more user-friendly for any person to go on and see what a bill is, what it really means, and where it's at in the process and what steps it needs to take to pass so people can be meaningfully engaged in the process. This has been happening for a long time. These rules have been this way, and people like Senator Costa, who've been around longer than I have tried in the past. And I'm really grateful to have people like the 534 people on this call, and hopefully more who watch it afterwards, get engaged in the process of bringing this to light so we actually have some leverage to get rules in place that will make it more fair for everybody, because at the end of the day, that's going to be better for all of us. So I just want to thank you for that, and I look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Senator Williams, for being with us. And we will come back, and some of your questions, we will be directing them to Senator Williams and others who are here with us today. Next, I want to say that Senator Williams is a Democrat. We have legislators from both sides of the aisle with us today. Very appreciative of them. I just also want to point, I know that in Tony's presentation, he talks, that legislators aren't listening. We know that there are legislators who do listen. And we know there are legislators who are trying very hard to represent constituents. What we're really talking about is rules that get in the way of that, rules that make it really hard to have that happen, rules that legislators, so I know legislators, we had somebody talk about running on the property tax reform issue back in the 90s. And we know we've got 3 decades worth of legislators who have run on property tax reform and nothing's happened. It's not that people don't go to Harrisburg really determined to change things and to make sure we have equitable school funding that is not on the burdened on the back of older property owners, which is what often happens. And yet they get there and they find there's no good way to come up with a good bill that will get passed, because there's not collaboration, because there's not working across the aisle, because there's not an opportunity to really have those complicated discussions so those bills get passed. So I just want to say I'm really appreciative of the legislators who are here today talking with us. And there are many legislators who want to do this. It's the structure of things that gets in the way. And we're looking at ways to say, let's put a structure in place that allows the kind of collaboration that many of our legislators would like to take place. So I want to introduce Representative Wendy Thomas. She is a Republican. She is from Bucks County, House District 178. I really appreciate Representative Thomas. She was the prime sponsor of our LACRA bill in the House Bill 2638. And she has been a supporter of redistricting reform since she was elected in 2018, and was willing to talk a little bit about what happened to LACRA, but also her experience with the rules in the House this session. Thank you, Representative Thomas, for joining us.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you for being here. And just an update, I put the co-sponsor memo out today for that for the next session. So yeah, I guess I want to echo a couple things that people have said. I believe most of us work really hard to represent our constituents and go there with the rules. And I will tell you, I am a 2-year legislator. I've been in the legislature for 18 and 19. The first day you're sworn in, you can't move forward till you do rules. And so it makes it very challenging to look for and do a number of changes without having a meeting to prep for that. So I know Representative Gene DiGirolamo, who's been a big supporter, he put together a legislation to put a committee together, and I know everybody hates that, put a committee together to amend the rules, but there are a lot of rules and there's different groups of people who want to see different changes. And at the end of the day, you've got to come together with what a majority of the people want to see changed. I was very big when I first got there. I still feel this way, that if a bill, there's 203 of us in the House, if a bill gets 102 signatures, co-sponsors, then it should be run. It should be run. I believe there's something similar to that at the US level. I really still feel that way. There are a lot of changes and things that people would like to see that are different in the rules, but without a consensus and a directed effort prior to that first day, because once you're there on the first day, you can't move forward till you vote on the rules and the rules go through. And I believe the last time, as I understand it, they changed the rules, and maybe one of the legislators who have been here longer, they did put a bipartisan committee together and work for a little bit of time, a month, I think it was 4 or 8 weeks, and then make some proposals to rule changes. Last year when we adopted the rules, we did make it an open-ended so that they could have been reopened at any time and changed, but you've got to get a majority of people who want to do that. So these individual topics, as far as the transparency bill that I worked on, it started to get some movement in the Senate. And so when I talked to the state government committee in the House, they seemed more inclined to wait till the bill came from the Senate, thinking it might be changed. And this is the one of the things that I was talked to. I mean, there's bills that come out of the House. I think this session we've passed more bills than in recent history, although I heard all of our efficiency numbers. But as far as just a raw number, and then they went to the Senate, and I believe the Senate passed less bills. So it takes a lot of work to get a single bill passed. There were over 4,000 bills proposed, or 5,000, you guys had those numbers. I don't see any way, even though we have the largest full-time legislature, that we're ever going to get through that many bills and the debate and the committee meetings that go with that. But if somebody can gather enough support and get 102 people, I certainly think that says majority of the House wants to talk about this, wants to deal with it, it should come up. That's a little bit about my experience, and I'm happy to stay on for questions.
Thank you so much, Representative Thomas. We're going to move on and hear from Representative Innamorato, and then we will take a bunch of questions. So Representative Innamorato, Sarah Innamorato is a Democrat. She's from Allegheny County, House District 21. And again, she was elected in 2018. And so she's coming to this from her perspective. Love to hear what she has to say. And then we will pause and have some answers to questions from our three who were elected in 2018. And then we do have some folks who have been around for quite a bit longer who will talk about some past reform efforts and some ideas. So you've already heard a few ideas. We'll hear a few more ideas, and by the end we'll have plenty of ideas. And I will say this is an open conversation. We still haven't said this is what we're supporting as Fair Districts PA. We're trying to raise the conversation, say why we're having this conversation, and hear from legislators, hear from other organizations as we move forward. So thank you so much, Senator Representative Innamorato, for being with us today.
Sure thing. Thank you so much for having me. And I really do appreciate Fair Districts and all of the members involved in it. You know, democracy doesn't begin and end at the ballot box. It takes an engaged citizenry, and it takes organizations like this that's fueled by its members to actually create change in our public sector. So my name is Sarah Innamorato. I represent the 21st District, which is Pittsburgh and Northern Allegheny County. And I think it's important to say that I actually ran against a Democratic incumbent. And I ran against a Democratic incumbent because I felt like my party wasn't representing working people any longer. And I say that because I think that I am kind of the majority of people, where I don't necessarily feel like I am defined by one party or the other. I happen to be a Democrat, but I'm also feel very comfortable being critical of the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party. And we see that reflected in our voter registration. A lot of voters that are registering are actually registering as independents because they aren't necessarily tied to one party or the other. They're really looking for representation and people who are going to go make a difference in their day-to-day lives. And I would describe myself probably like as a progressive populist. I believe in democracy in all facets of our society, from our public sector and civic sector to our workplace and in our communities, and really believe in local control and community knowledge. And I remember sharing that with some of my Republican colleagues when I first got in, and they kind of looked at me, they're like, "Are you sure you're not a Republican? Local control?" And I think that's like reflective of the reality of the House chamber, is that if I have individual conversations with people who aren't of the same party as me, I can find places where our convictions overlap, where we didn't compromise on our beliefs or our value system or our upbringing or our people that we represent, but we said, hey, we sat down and we understood where our priorities are the same. And I found that in having conversations around, you know, issues like this and strengthening democracy, talking about employee ownership, whether that's ESOPs or worker cooperatives, things around ending corporate welfare. There are Republicans who are excited to work on those issues. And, but what we've seen here and the examples that have been given with the presentation that Tony provided is that even though there's this energy and this willingness to work on these issues, there's really not a way to facilitate that kind of robust dialogue in order to actually get those ideas out into a forum where it can be drafted into legislation, where there's a place to be critical of that legislation and look at it line by line and really understand what the consequences are once that is interpreted in the real world. And then, you know, obviously it never comes up for a vote. So, you know, there's no lack of energy or good ideas in that chamber. They're just capped. That potential is capped by the way that the institution is structured. And right now it's not very democratic, which is how I came to be involved in this discussion, because democracy should thrive on the outside and it should also thrive in the halls of Harrisburg. And, you know, I think a lot of this has to do with if we don't do something about this, not only do we face the consequences of not having new ideas brought up, not having good legislation passed. Like Senator Williams said, the legislation that does pass can have a lot of deficiencies in it, but we continue to erode the public trust. And when I think a lot about what's wrong with our democracy today, why is there so much polarization? Why is there so much hate? Why is there so much lack of understanding? It's trust. And the public trust in our governing institutions has declined precipitously over the last couple decades. And when people feel like they continually pay their taxes, put money into the public coffers, and they don't know where that money goes, and they don't know what the people who are in power are doing for them to like make their communities better, to make their lives better, that trust is further eroded. And so, you know, for us as elected representatives, we should be extremely passionate about making sure that we have institutions that are transparent and actually work for people, because we need to rebuild that public trust. And it's only through the rebuilding of that trust that we can actually not only pass meaningful legislation and policies, but, you know, start to create a society that gets along a little bit better and has a better understanding and a stronger empathy towards one another. And so I really do think that this is one of those root issues that aren't super glamorous to talk about, but a lot of things can be traced back to it, and a lot of explanation for why things don't happen. This can be one of the things that we point to.
Thank you so very much, all three of you. And we are gonna, if you could each unmute yourselves, and we will answer some questions. We've got lots of questions, and there's no way we're gonna get to all of the questions. We're gonna tackle a few of them. So one of them, Representative Innamorato, you began on this. Do members of both parties collaborate when they are on the same committee, because then they are at least in the same room?
No, I don't think committees are used as that structure. Committees are used as like a step one, right? It's just kind of like, it depends on who runs your committee. If you have a really great executive director, you'll have a pre-committee meeting and you'll go over a piece of legislation, you'll go over line by line and actually have a critique of it. That doesn't always happen. And the committee, because like Senator Williams said, you may get a bill right before it, or you may get an amendment right before it. So you don't even really have time to think through it and to do your research and come up with some really poignant line of questioning to see if it's actually robust. Now we have hearings that are done through committees. I think it's an underutilized platform, but it's actually through committee hearings that I feel like a lot of really good dialogue has come up. For example, we had an automatic license plate reader bill in transportation, and I was able to talk about security in the Fourth Amendment and why I felt like this was, there were issues with this bill as written. And the guy who wrote it, Representative Rothman, pulled me aside and was like, hey, you know a lot about this issue, let's talk. And so that if we had more instances where that kind of dialogue could happen, then I think we would get stronger legislation. It's just not the norm.
Yeah, I would agree. More hearings and also more notice with the bills so that you have the time to, when I get a bill, 30 minutes before I go into a committee hearing, I can't, like Representative Inamorata said, I can't talk to the person. But if I get it a day before, 2 days before, I can call them up and say, hey, I have a question about this. What about this language? And things might be able to be tweaked before you end up voting on it. And sometimes it's a minor thing that makes a big difference. And that process is important, and I don't think we are utilizing it. Actually, I know we're not utilizing it in the way that ends up with legislation that is best for everyone.
So we have a number of questions asking about other states, and I will say that one of the reasons why we had such difficulty enacting redistricting reform is because we don't have initiative and referendum here in Pennsylvania. The states that have been able to do that do have initiative and referendum. What would it take to get that? Well, that would be a constitutional amendment as well. And what we've learned is Pennsylvania has one of the most difficult processes to get a constitutional amendment in place. And the same people who hold power over the legislative agenda are the ones who want to keep that power and make it very difficult to push reforms. As Tony's, I call it the tight knot of dysfunction, that little circuit that he had, the people who draw the line, set the rules, set the agenda, block reform, continue in that tight knot of dysfunction. And this goes, another of the questions was, how long has this been going on? I would say this has been going on a long time. I think Representative Freeman will be talking a bit. He was first elected back in 1980. We'll get to that introduction. But according to him, it was not always this way, but probably the last 30 years, it's been a challenge. And in Pennsylvania, this entrenchment of power has been played out for a very long time. There are democracies that are much younger in other states where the two-party system is not nearly as entrenched. That would be a good history paper for someone to write. There's a question I want to ask you legislators. I heard that a representative will be punished if they don't support the vote for the rules. Can you talk a little bit about pressure to vote not only on the vote for the rules, and it was not unanimous, it has not been unanimous, but is there pressure to vote on things like the rules, and is there pressure for votes on other things or to vote against other things? Can you talk about the pressure that you experience a little bit?
I want to give Wendy first shot because she hasn't spoken yet.
There's pressure, but if you ran in a campaign, you can't be not used to pressure. So I mean, I think the ultimate question is there retribution? No, are people unhappy because you voted a certain way or didn't vote a certain way? I would say the greatest dysfunction happens when somebody doesn't tell the maker of a bill that they're going to vote a certain way and that person thought they were going to, and they have a close vote, and then it doesn't go the way they want because they thought you told them you were going to do something and you changed your mind. That's probably the hardest part that I've seen. But I don't know how you get to the legislature if you can't stand up to somebody who's trying to convince you of something you don't want to do. And I don't know about you other ladies if you agree, but you need to have a thick skin. So I don't have any problem standing up and saying, I voted against a quote unquote the caucus, or voted for something I didn't think my district wanted. And most of the people in my party voted for it. You have to represent your people. You really do.
I agree with Rep. Thomas is that you do have to stand up and just be like, I'm not doing this. I think that there's these old school tales of people who didn't vote a certain way and they got their office taken away or whatever. And that did happen in the past. I have to say that I personally have, since being there, has not experienced that. And I think I've been very vocal, participate in our caucus. So I don't see that happen. There is whipping, there is vote counting, there is, there will be pressure, but you're just honest with people and like, no, I'm not going to vote that way.
Mhm.
Sometimes there's fear tactics used by legislators, like, oh, if you vote that way, they're going to do a mailer against you and it's going to say this. And you're like, okay, sure. They're going to say, whoever doesn't want you in that seat of power is going to say whatever they want, or, construe any action the way that they want to craft their narrative. So if you can release that, then, you're kind of.
Kim,
good
can I
to
add
go.
one thing? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I do think in talking to some of my, you exchange phone numbers with people, and I have Democrats I routinely talk to or whatever. I do have to say that one thing that happened this year with COVID was we weren't physically in the building. So if you asked about committees, I would say there's a lot of time I'm walking down the hall and I'm like, oh, did you see that bill? And it's whoever's walking down, might be Sarah, and I'll be like, what do you think? Or the lead topic came up. I was talking to Mary Isaacson. She was working on a bill with that. I was like, oh, I think some people are worried about this. Could we tweak it? It would probably get through. Like casual, I would call them hallway conversations. But we went to COVID. We went to our home offices, and the only people we got information from, it was very isolating. We weren't bumping into somebody across the aisle. And I do not think it was healthy. There was no natural, and sometimes you want to know what the other party read about the bill because you didn't think of the problem they brought up. And, those conversations, it may be bad enough that the system isn't set up to have them, but when you're not even in the Capitol to bump into people and have them, is a problem. The one place I do think they happen, just as a one sidebar, is in caucuses. So a lot of our caucuses are bipartisan. And, a caucus is just something somebody joins because they're interested in the topic. And I think there has been a few good things that have come out of them.
Can you say a little bit more about caucuses? What are the topics of caucuses? Who runs them? How does that work?
So as far as I understand it, anybody can start one. I am co-chair with a Democrat. And we try to do them bipartisan, like of the Delaware Canal Caucus, because my district's on it and there's a bunch of us. We worry about the environmental preservation of the canal and issues and topics that are around that. It's challenging to get meeting times and have people show up, but you're all concerned about the same thing. And several times we all got together to issue a statement of support or concern about something that was happening. There's a student debt caucus that is bipartisan. Sometimes they're bicameral, Senator.
Yes, there are.
Which is even better because, as I said, one of the issues came with my bill. I was like, well, can't the state government committee run it? And they're like, well, we think the Senate bill's coming over, so we're waiting. Sometimes you get that intercameral, so it's even better when it's some senators, some reps, everybody's interested in the same topic. And I have found that they are mostly bipartisan and good conversation happens. Just my 2 cents.
And I just with caucuses too, it's actually one of those points of like, there's not a whole lot of transparency. Like it's really hard to get a list of all the caucuses that exist and who runs them. And some have, it's varying degrees of the infrastructure support that they have. I co-founded Welcoming PA Caucus, which focuses on immigrant justice. Right now we are trying to work on being more bipartisan, and we do have campaigns that we're running that are working on building those relationships. But we've kind of used caucuses as a way to encourage co-governing and to encourage this kind of dialogue that I think a lot of us really crave, while also bringing in outside stakeholders. So not just the people who wrote the biggest check to certain campaign funds, but the people who are actually out there living and breathing the work and have to deal with the consequences with the decisions that are being made in Harrisburg. So they are a powerful yet informal and highly under-resourced and underutilized tool.
Well, it's good to hear about that. One last question, and I know that some of you have to go. The question is the problem in Pennsylvania similar to that in the Congress, where the majority leader or the Speaker of the House can block legislation that would otherwise receive broad bipartisan support?
I mean, that is accurate. And in the Senate, it's a little different because we're a lot smaller. So it can be, one senator that blocks it from moving in the Senate. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be the leader. It could be somebody else in the caucus. They have kind of informal working rules within the majority caucus about member support before running a bill on the floor because they don't want to jeopardize or put any of their members at risk for voting against a bill that maybe everybody likes, like Victoria's Law, which is to stop puppy mills in Pennsylvania. That has broad bipartisan support, and there is, you know, probably one person that is holding that up from coming to the floor. But we know once it would be there, it would pass. Same thing with not the non-discrimination bill. So there are individual people who have a lot of power.
So what would be a way to make sure that that doesn't happen? So if you look at so there are these behind the scenes rules, these unstated rules that voters aren't aware of, and voters just say, why in the world would that bill not get a vote? As voters become more aware, how can voters put pressure? But what kind of rule would it take to make that change?
I think there are a couple different ways that you could go about it, and that's what Senator Katie Muth and I have been working on some changes, and we've been talking to Senator Costa, and when we talked to him about some of our ideas, his staff literally gave us a book of rule changes that they've attempted in prior sessions. So there are things like every bill gets a vote, every bill is allowed to get a hearing, or making rules that, you know, the minority chair of the committee can call a hearing too. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I don't think there's just one solution, but what I think is great is that opportunity like this to get citizen activism involved in bringing this attention and letting every legislator know that they're paying attention and they want to see more bills get just out in public and get discussed.
Great.
Earl, I'd like to chime in real quick.
Who is this?
This is Rep. Rabb.
Yes. Well, you know what, Rep. Rabb, you're going to have a chance to answer all of these too, because I know these representatives have to pop off, and I'm about to introduce the next set. So hang on to that thought, and we will get to you. And Representative Todd Stevens is our next speaker. He's a Republican from Montgomery County, House District 151. He was elected in 2010, and he's had some bills with very strong public support that have gone nowhere. And he has graciously agreed to talk with us about that. And then we will hear from several others, and then we'll have another set of Q&A at the end of that. So Representative Stevens, and thank you so much to those who were with us. Really appreciate your input. Go ahead, Representative Stevens. Thanks.
Carol, thank you so much. And thanks for putting this together. You know, one of the things, you know, there was a lot of doom and gloom that was shared here, although the facts dispute some of what's been laid out. And I do think it's important to mention them. In the 2019-20 session, the House passed 670 bills, 670. Which I don't have the figure in front of me of the most recent sessions, but I believe was a productive session by comparison to other legislative sessions. But here's the most important statistic, I think. 96% of those bills enjoyed bipartisan support. 96%. 65% of those bills were unanimous. You know, so I think that I want to make sure that we don't overstate the issue. There's no question we can improve our rules, and we can make the legislature more responsive, and we can make sure that the members of the legislature have a voice. But, you know, a couple of things that were mentioned that, you know, just aren't true. The House rules provide mechanisms for a majority of the members, once a bill is out of committee, for a majority of the members to call a bill up for a vote. You know, there's a motion to remove a bill from the table. There's a motion for a special order of business. There's there are motions where you can, the majority leader doesn't have, you know, the end all be all control. Now, from a practical standpoint, the majority leader generally governs the calendar. They put the things on the calendar, and they set the agenda. But there is an opportunity, and look, I've done it before. I made a special order of business to consider a bill. Not this session, but the past session. And I can tell you it's very real, you know, that there is in some institutional, I'll say, I don't want to say institutional retribution because that's probably overstating it, but you know, there are some folks that you end up answering to when you do something like that. It's not a popular move to go ahead and make a motion for a special order of business. I know as earlier Representative Thomas was mentioning, our former colleague, Representative Gene DiGirolamo, he made a number of motions to either table bills or re-refer bills or call up bills, over the course of my career. And again, they're not always popular, but the way I like to explain it to my constituents is, I was not elected, I wasn't elected to represent the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or any other party. I was elected to represent my district. And in high school, I was voted most outspoken, and I think I'm by now one of the most outspoken members of my caucus. I probably have the most independent voting record in many respects in my caucus, and so I'm certainly not afraid to vote against the majority if the majority party if my district feels another way. And so all that being said, I think one of the places where we really could use some improvement is the committee process. The committee process is really locked down, and I know you're going to have Representative Freeman speak in a minute, so I'll make this quick. But he and I have had some great conversations over the last couple of years. I'm interested to hear more of his thoughts on how we can improve that. There is a discharge process in our rules, but over the 10 years that I've been in the House now, I've only seen that used a handful of times, and it's been sort of co-opted, and its effectiveness has been severely diminished by the way it's been utilized. So, to the point about whether 102 members, I think 102 members of the House ought to be able to do whatever it is they would like, whether it's tabling a bill, moving a bill, or anything else, amending a bill. It ought to be a majority rule in the House for the membership. It's interesting because one of the things I want to make sure that the folks listening and paying attention here are aware of is there are different rules in the House and Senate. So in the House, we do have timelines. It's not to say that, on occasion, bills aren't sprung on us at the last minute, but we do have requirements, timelines from when a bill comes over from the Senate, timelines from when a bill is amended to when we can consider it. Things like that do give us a little bit of a heads up. It doesn't sound like maybe some of those rules are in place over in the Senate, but I wanted to be sure everyone understands that there are different sets of rules. One of the other things that has always troubled me, and I do work collaboratively quite a bit. Most of my bills enjoy pretty broad bipartisan support, and I work across the aisle pretty regularly. I'm in a district that is, neither party has a majority. Both Republicans and Democrats are in the low 40%, and then the independents make up the difference. So, I enjoy working across the aisle. I enjoy collaborating with my colleagues, and that process occurs well in advance of any committee meeting or committee hearing. I mean, I can tell you, Representative Driscoll and I, we worked on a bill last session, and we got it out of committee, and we didn't get it across the finish line. There was nothing nefarious that occurred with it. It just, it didn't get across the finish line. So, we were texting this morning and we're reintroducing it, and, we'll have that in place next week. So the collaborative process is still alive and well. There are plenty of us that work across the aisle when we're introducing bills, and try to work in a bipartisan manner, to get things done. So I think one other place that I think we could really improve things, and I forget who mentioned it earlier, but there was talk about retribution from leadership if you don't vote the right way. I always thought it was odd that I'm sitting here in my district office, and my staff are everybody's staff. Everybody has a different. It's not like we have uniform budgets for our staff, for instance. We don't all have the same number of staff members. They don't all get paid, uniform salary. A lot of people may not understand there is a Republican House print shop and a Democratic House print shop. There is a Republican House IT department and a Democratic House IT department. There are, there's just a number of different things that I think, could be placed under one umbrella. Look, we all represent 62,000 people. Obviously the sizes of our districts are a little different, so you may have to make some accommodations, but, my understanding is Congress figures out a way to say, all right, here's a uniform allocation for, your staff, the number, you can spend it however you want to spend it. You can have one person that's making, X, or you can have, 10 people making X divided by 10. To me, there ought to be more uniformity, which would alleviate some of the concerns about what leadership can and can't do if they want to try to pressure you on a vote. You know, I can tell you over my 10 years, you know, there's been maybe a handful of times where I felt like anyone was, you know, getting heavy-handed or pressuring me, certainly never threatening to take something away or anything else like that. But, you know, there is an institutional pressure that sometimes you feel. Again, I've been pretty outspoken, so I haven't been afraid to vote no if my district demanded it. But at the same time, you know, I can see how others may feel pressured, particularly if you haven't been around a long time and you don't aren't aware of all these other rules and things like that. So, at any rate, I think you know, I just wanted to. I don't want to overstate the problem. I think there are things that we need to fix. I think the discharge process is one of them. I think that by maybe having more of a centralized, you know, printing operation, IT operation, things like that, you know, you relieve some of that pressure maybe that, you know, leaders might be able to exert on members, particularly new members. So I'll leave it at that and let you move on to the next one.
Thank you, and stay for questions at the end of this. Representative Robert Freeman from Northampton, House District 136. He's a Democrat. He was elected to the House in 1982, served 6 terms, left to run for Senate, lost by just a tiny margin, and then came back to the House in 1988 and has been serving in that capacity since 1998. He has been part of a number of efforts to change the rules, and we look forward to hearing from you, Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you for setting up this town hall forum to talk about a very important issue in terms of legislative rules reform. I think my video is unable to be opened. If someone on your staff could open it for me, I'll be able to address our audience.
Let's see if we can do that. I think you have to do it yourself.
I tried and it said, oh, good, we're open. Good, thanks. And thank you very much for holding this forum. I think it's important. I know that rules reform oftentimes sounds like insider baseball, very dry stuff, but it's critically important because it sets the parameters in which legislation either passes or doesn't pass, as this town hall has pointed out. And as Carol mentioned, I've been an advocate for rules reform for a very long time. Probably the last 27 years, I have been one of the leaders in trying to push for rules reform and collaborated with Republican colleagues in almost all of those occasions to try and see if we can make some substantive, substantial changes that make for a better process in the legislative process. As I mentioned, the rules are critical. They set the parameters for how we operate. They set down procedures to be observed in terms of what legislation can advance and how, and what legislation oftentimes gets bottled up in committee. And as someone who has advocated for rules reform over those many years, my goals have been, 1, to create greater transparency, 2, to have greater accountability in the process, the legislative process, and 3, and very fundamentally important, to empower rank and file members. As Tony's presentation pointed out, and as the realities are on the ground in the legislative process, leaders have tremendous amount of influence and control over the legislative process. And oftentimes, new members feel stifled in that process. They have great ideas, they wish to promote them, and unfortunately they get pushed aside oftentimes. So I think it's important that we empower our rank and file members to have an active role in the process. In terms of, oops.
Did we lose you?
Yeah, I'm trying to get back in. I'm
I
sorry.
think you're still there. You're good. We
Can
can
you
still
see me?
see you. We can still hear you.
Can you see me at all, or?
Yep, we can see you and we can hear you. Yep,
Okay, my screen's not showing it, but sorry for that interruption.
that's okay. We can hear you.
Yeah, as I've mentioned, I've been active as an advocate for rules reform for a very long time. My first effort was in 1993 when I joined with the Republican House member Ken Lee. Ken's a Republican, I'm a Democrat. but we saw the need for reforming our House rules to make them a more open process and to ensure that members were better informed as what was coming up for a vote. Back then, you'd go to the floor and you wouldn't know what would come up for a vote that day on the floor. There would be a House calendar with potential bills that could be voted on second or third consideration, but we got no advance notice in those days as to what actually would come up for a vote. So we advocated a very simple change to the rules. Give us advance notice 2 days ahead of time. Let us know what will be posted for a vote on such and such a date. After a rather concerted struggle to get that passed in the rules, we did succeed back in 1993. Leadership did want a trade-off. They wanted to make sure that amendments were also posted ahead of time. Prior to that, you could submit an amendment minutes before a bill was voted and it had consideration. But one of the compromises was if we got a heads up on what bills would be voted in advance, amendments also had to be posted in advance. And that seemed like a reasonable compromise at the time. I think, oh, there we are. Okay, I'm sorry. Still having trouble with my video. So that was one of the achievements we had, and it laid kind of dormant after that for a while. But then in 2007, there was a real hunger, a real resurgence for rules reform in the chamber. The fiasco of the pay raise in 2005, orchestrated by the legislative leaders, Deweese and Purcell, had caused a backlash in the 2006 elections. Many members were elected on reform platforms advocating for changes in Harrisburg. So there was a real opportunity to effect change. John Purcell was not reselected as Speaker. A coalition of Republicans and Democrats chose Denny O'Brien from Northeast Philadelphia, a Republican, to replace him. And under Denny's leadership, he formed a bipartisan Speakers Commission on Legislative Reform. And we looked at more than just rules, but our first efforts were on rules reform. And I served on that committee with 23 other members. There were 12 Democrats and 12 Republicans. And we were very deliberative in going over what we thought the changes should be. And we voted on all those proposed changes to make sure there was a consensus on the commission. Out of that, we made a number of changes that were adopted on our House rules. We determined that no sessions should occur between 11 p.m. at night and 8 in the morning. The pay raise had occurred in the middle of the night, and that left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths. Many budget proposals were voted on in those days in the wee hours of the morning when members were not thinking clearly, and getting information on what was contained in budget proposals was very difficult. So we prohibited late meetings after 11 p.m. until 8 in the morning, unless there'd be a 3/4 vote of the body to suspend that rule. We also required that bills would be amended on second. Previous to that, most bills were amended on third consideration. Every bill has to have 3 readings. And in the old days, bills would oftentimes be amended on third consideration and then vote on the same day, without the opportunity of the member to see how the amendments fit into the text of the bill to determine what its impact was on the legislation, how it read, whether it was drafted appropriately. So we made a change, which we still abide by today, which called for amendments to occur on second consideration, and then final passage would occur on third, where only technical amendments would be permitted. We also allowed that a replacement amendment could be offered if a member's amendment was bumped by another amendment. That was a practice that was used by the majority party quite frequently, to have an omnibus amendment which knocked all the other amendments out of order. So if that were to occur under our rules, they would have the opportunity to redraft the amendment and resubmit it for consideration. We also had a very important rule in the beginning that bills on concurrence coming back from the Senate could not be voted on without 24 hours advance notice. That gave the public and the members greater opportunity to get a better handle on what was in the bill, particularly lengthy bills that dealt with major policy initiatives. And we also required that bills that had been amended on second could not be voted for 24 hours on third, until again the public and members had an opportunity to see the changes that were made by the amendment process. We curtailed the power of the Rules Committee so that they could no longer amend bills in committee. There was a practice of putting bills in the Rules Committee. They would amend whatever language they wanted into it. It would come out of the Rules Committee, and members of the House were not permitted to offer amendments to what they had changed. It was a simple up and down vote. Now the Rules Committee can only revert to a prior printer's number on a bill coming back from concurrence on the Senate. And we made changes to allow greater debate on adjournment motions, tabling motions, and motions to suspend the rules so that more rank and file members could actually debate those motions, which are critical motions that can determine the life or death of a bill on the floor of the House. We eliminated capital leave, though that returned in a form with the remote proxy process that we needed to adopt to deal with the COVID-19 situation and to vote remotely from our offices. And that actually has worked fairly well. And we also voted that votes in the chamber, in committee, on the floor, and expenses would be posted on the internet so the public would have greater access to how we voted on such matters. And we also strengthened ethics standards, which was an important consideration. Over time, many of these reforms were eroded somewhat. The 24-hour rule on concurrence, on conference committee reports, and on bills proceeding to third after being amended on second has been whittled down to 3 hours. We really need to restore a longer period of time for the public and members to have more time to look at legislation that has been changed or altered or is quite lengthy in form. And as Carol knows, in 2019, as a response to not being able to get our reapportionment reform measure that Fair Districts PA has advocated for so strongly, not being able to get that to the floor, we offered many amendments to the rules changes, but unfortunately they were blocked. And as Tony's presentation pointed out, that was because an amendment to the rules was adopted not allowing amendments. And I have spoken many times on opening day, on our inauguration day, saying don't advocate your responsibility as a member, don't give it away by adopting rules when we need to have a more thoughtful process in adopting those rules. So what changes do I think are essential? As basic changes, I think we need to ensure that bills that have strong bipartisan support, a minimum of say 20 Republicans and 20 Democrats, should be required to be brought up in committee to have a vote and consideration on the proposal. And any bill, in my opinion, that has a majority of the House as co-sponsors, 102 or more, should be brought up for a vote on the House floor. By getting a majority of the members as co-sponsors, it deserves to be considered by the entire floor. And we need to restore some of those time limitations, the 24-hour waiting period on concurrence, on conference committees, and on bills moving from second to third when they've been amended. And it wouldn't be a bad idea to reconstitute the Speaker's Legislative Reform Commission, to give a period of time, 3 or 4 months in the beginning of our session, to look at rules reforms and other reforms that we could enact in regard to how the legislature conducts itself and how it proceeds on policy, to make for a better process, again, a more transparent and accountable process, and to really empower those rank and file members who deserve to have their voices heard and to be at that table in deciding on matters of policy. One thing I do want to touch on too is what Todd Stevens brought up, and that's the committee process. And I think Sarah Enamorata also touched on it. Many committees don't function as effectively as they can. I'm very fortunate in that the House Local Government Committee, in which I am the Democratic chair, and my Republican counterpart, Dan Mall, try and be as deliberative as we can in that process. He is very open to me having input into how we proceed on legislation that comes before the committee. And when I was majority chair, I tried to make it a even more deliberative process. We had informational meetings on bills that were going to be coming up for a vote at some point, and sort of a markup session process that allowed members to offer thoughts on how we could alter legislation before we got to a formal meeting to amend and to adopt. And to tell you the truth, I was very bipartisan. In my first term as majority chair of the Local Government Committee, I ended up reporting more Republican bills out of that committee than I did Democratic bills, because more had been introduced to my committee and because they were good bills. I had told my staff, I don't care if it's a Democratic bill or a Republican bill. If it's a good proposal, it deserves to get a hearing. It deserves to come before our committee. And that's how we should function. That's how we should operate.
Thank you so much, Representative Freeman. You give us lots of really good history. And Representative Rabb, sorry to keep you waiting. You are last of our lineup, and then we will have just a few moments for question and answer, I'm afraid. Representative Rabb is from Philadelphia. He's a Democrat. He was elected in 2016. He's the founding chair of the Pennsylvania House Democratic Caucus Equity Committee. And one of the issues that arises with rules is that it shuts out lots of voices, and only a certain fraction of voices get heard. And Representative Rabb has been kind of calling attention to that within his own caucus. I'd love to have him talk a little bit about that for us. And he also has some thoughts on infrastructure, which is something that Representative Stevens brought up. We don't have much time left, but Representative Rabb, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. So yeah, a lot of important issues raised. I can see from the Q&A and chat that there are a lot of deeply disturbed and frustrated, even angered people. That means that you're paying attention. And I encourage you to channel that energy into positive action, ideally collectively, and consider nonviolent direct action. Protest works. We've seen that. We would not be where we are today without those types of protests, and being reasonable with folks who are not acting reasonable, who are not logical or even empathetic. You got to have a different strategy. But as it relates to equity, I've sought to imbue into our caucus, the House Democratic Caucus, ways of looking at equity in different ways. So for instance, my first 4 years in office, there were no women who were minority chairs of standing committees. Now, the response to that by a lot of folks was, oh, well, that's not sexism. That's because there were no women senior enough to be minority chairs from the Democratic Caucus. But why is that? Why are men so overwhelmingly overrepresented in terms of seniority? Well, it was a heck of a lot harder to be elected as a woman 30 years ago, 20 years ago, than it is today. So we're dealing with systemic issues that are born of patriarchy, sexism, and misogyny. So how do we address those issues to have the type of equity those of us in public service claim to embrace? And I also want to mention too, I do think there's a lot of pressure to get in line on both sides. If you can just look at HR 1 from last year and see who supported it, who didn't. There's a lot of party line voting on really important procedural things that go against the very type of reforms that folks in this forum seek to promote. There is retaliation. It's not just rumors, it's true. If you are Senator Williams, I believe, and Rep. Innamorato talked about caucuses like interest caucus, like Women's Health Caucus, or Black Caucus, what have you. If you're a caucus that has some substance and size and influence, you may ask for money to have one or more staffers. But that is determined by one person. And for us, Dems presently, that's the minority leader. Well, there are there are repercussions if you don't get in line. I think you could say that about any environment, in any professional environment, even any social environment. So to downplay retribution, I think it's there, it's real. Also, most bills that are voted on are namers, resolutions and such. You add all of that into the thousands of bills that have come across our desks, been circulated. I'm not going to say inconsequential, but they are not the substantive bills that a lot of folks care about most deeply as it relates to impacting people's lives. They are non-controversial minor bills. So the vast majority of people, whether they're on the far right or those of us who are progressive, we vote overwhelmingly in a bipartisan fashion. So, but if we're really talking about the bills that folks talk about around the dinner table and the water cooler, those bills don't see the light of day. Whether they're bipartisan, whether they're substantive, where they've been reintroduced a million times, those things aren't happening, and that's for structural reasons. And these types of hierarchical systems remain because the vast majority of people, including members of the press, don't really understand it. And so they're not raising the right questions. And not just voters, and I take exception to how much we're talking about voters, because we all represent roughly 63,000 people, most of whom do not vote, but we represent all of them, whether they're undocumented men and women, whether they're folks, folks for religious reasons who don't vote, people who are not old enough to vote. We represent their interests too. And they need to be empowered to understand the systems and make change. And I got to tell you, as one example, a handful of us, most of whom were pretty new to the legislature, got 2 bills enacted into law within 36 days because we did a nonviolent direct action on the House floor, and we hadn't done anything on those issues for at least 36 years or 360 years around police accountability and police terror. Nonviolent direct action works. And as long as citizens, voters, residents do not understand the real systems and the things that are happening behind the scenes, then they're distracted by headlines and other things, and the real stuff is going on in the hallways of power, and they need to be aware and they need to be engaged, because when we mobilize collectively, we win. I wouldn't be here. I descend from 16 great-great-grandparents most of whom were born into states where slavery was the law of the land. They didn't wait for Abraham Lincoln to free them. They freed themselves and influenced public policy, cultural norms, et cetera, for generations. This is our charge. We must do the same thing.
Thank you so much, Representative Rabb. And if we are kind of out of time, but let's circle back if there's anything that any of you want to comment on from what was raised. I guess I'm looking, there's so many great questions and you've raised so many great comments. I'm feeling very much the need, we've got to find a forum to continue some of these conversations. So what I will say is, people say, well, what can we as voters do? And I would say the first thing we can do is understand. And so, we started with gerrymandering to say, take a look at your district maps and understand why these are drawn this way and who's harmed by that. And as people looked, they said, I remember in early days of doing speaking about gerrymandering and people coming up afterwards and saying, once I've seen this, then what, then I have to do something. And that's precisely right. It's once you look at the map, then you have to do something. You have to find a way to change it. And I think it's the same way with understanding the procedures and the rules, why good bills don't get a vote. People need to begin to pay attention. There are important bills that sit in committee year after year, don't get a vote. And so what we need to be doing is calling attention to those and helping people understand it's not that those solutions aren't out there. It's not that there aren't people introducing those solutions. It's that those solutions are not being moved. And we need to understand why they're not being moved, and we need to put pressure to make them move. So we will continue these conversations with legislators, with voters, and if each of you want to give one last quick word, I'll let you do that, and then we will be done for the day. So Representative Stevens, Representative Freeman, Representative Rabb, one last word, and then we will conclude. And if
I'll just say real quickly, there are politicians and then there's public servants. There's show horses and there's workhorses. And then there's folks who truly believe in more of an egalitarian approach to things, and those folks who just kind of intuitively embrace hierarchy. Hierarchy is what happens in Harrisburg. It is significantly part of the problem. And these issues have to be addressed, and we have to hold folks accountable, including those of us who are rank and file members of caucuses where we are not in the inner circles and do not inform the type of changes that all of you are demanding. We have to work together to make that happen.
Thank you.
And Carol, I'd just like to thank you and Fair Districts for pursuing this issue. It's very important. It may sound dry, but rules reform really is critical. It's the foundation upon which the whole process works. And if we're going to empower rank and file members, if we're going to have greater accountability and transparency, and if we're going to be able to move good legislation forward, it requires a more small d democratic process of rules in our chambers.
Thank you.
So I just, the last time Bob and I had an opportunity to talk about the rules, I think he was cooking some unbelievable dinner that, I forget what that was, Bob, but.
It was pork chops Milanese.
There you go, right? So at any rate, I'm hoping that next time we have this conversation will be, with that type of a meal around us. But either way, look, I think it's great that Fair Districts put this forum together, and I think it's terrific that we have this open exchange of ideas, because I really think that makes the system work that much better. I mean, the democratic process allows for inclusion and an exchange of ideas of diverse opinions and thoughts and regions. And we have a great diverse state here in Pennsylvania. And, you know, it's wonderful that everybody gets a say, and our rules should make sure that, you know, we can continue to legislate efficiently and effectively, but that, you know, everybody can have their voice heard. So I appreciate the opportunity to participate, and thanks, Carol, and the rest of your team for putting this together.
So thank you for being with us. Thank you, Tony, for your presentation. Thank you for all of you who joined us today. I feel badly that there were many who weren't, but we will be sending an email out with links to more information, with links to the video recording, and with ideas how to continue the conversation. As Tony said at the end of his presentation, we need to be talking to all of our legislators about how things work, about how bills move, and to say we want good bills to get a vote. We want help in making sure that good bills get a vote, and we want to be tracking those important bills that are solutions that people in Pennsylvania need that don't move, and we want to call attention to that with letters to the editor, with actions of different kinds, and we'll be discussing what some of that might look like. But it starts with talking to our own legislators and saying we want to see good bills move, and we want to see redistricting reform move, but we also want to make sure that it's an open and transparent and accountable process for all of us. So thank you all for being part of it. Thank you. Have a good evening, and we will certainly be in touch with an email very soon. Take care. Thanks for joining us.